All right, hello everyone. Welcome to this week. We're going to talk about discretion. This is the first section of the first module in the third section. So, those of you that had criminal justice classes are already probably pretty familiar with discretion. But discretion is simply just an official act by a criminal justice professional based on that individual's judgment about what the best course of action should be. So it's not necessarily an opinion, but it is a judgment call based on that one particular person's beliefs on what the best thing to do would be. And if you look throughout the criminal justice system, discretion is everywhere. Police, prosecutors, judges, probation and parole officers, conservation officers, everyone uses discretion to some degree in their duties. For example, let's just say real broadly here, if we're talking about the police, if you took away police officer discretion, that means that they would have to arrest or cite anyone and everyone who they saw violating any law at any time. So literally they would have to pull people over for going 1 mile an hour over the speed limit and write every person that they stopped a ticket. Okay, obviously that's not a feasible situation for them to be in. So discretion is an important aspect of the criminal justice profession, but probably not just unlimited discretion where people can do whatever they want, obviously. All right, so there's some potential abuses of discretion, things like discrimination, denial of due process, systematic under-enforcement of the law, which means that for whatever reason, the police or prosecutors or whoever is under-enforcing a certain segment of the law, poor personnel management, inconsistent policy. If one person is doing one thing and somebody is doing something completely different, if you have two police officers working the same shift and one person always arrests people for a certain thing and another officer never arrests anybody for that, that's inconsistent, right? You need to have some kind of consistency among officers within the same department. So having inconsistent uses of discretion is a problem. So then you have kind of proper exercises of discretion. So instead of discrimination, you would use good judgment. You would have efficient use of scarce resources. You would have some individualized justice, right? Because not everybody's situation is the same. You have two people committing the same act. Well, they both have different backgrounds. They have different situations occurring in their lives. So sometimes there needs to be some individualized justice. And it's sound public policy to have a proper exercise of discretion. All right, so where does discretion come from? What are these underlying sources of police discretion? Well, the first place is just in the nature of criminal law. Okay, if you've ever read criminal statutes, they're oftentimes somewhat vague or ambiguous. Okay, so then officers then have to determine whether or not whatever particular situation they're in, whether or not that fits the requirements for a particular offense. Or even is this first degree, is it second degree, is this third degree, right? So the nature of criminal law itself lends itself to the use of police discretion. You have conflicting public expectations. Okay? The public may not agree on what should or should not be legal, right? There's laws on the books that make something illegal, but the public doesn't agree that that should be illegal. So then you have this tension between the public and the police are supposed to serve the public. Now that doesn't mean the police are always supposed to not enforce things that the public doesn't like them. But a great example right now is the move to legalize marijuana in certain situations. Right, 20 years ago, everyone agreed that marijuana should be illegal all the time under all circumstances. Well, public expectations have changed over the years. And statutes have not necessarily caught up or kept up with what the public believes. So that is an example of where police discretion could be used in those circumstances. You have social medical issues. So police have to decide whether issues like homelessness, alcohol abuse, mental health issues, whether or not those warrant arrests, for what they're doing, or whether that warrants getting somebody some help or calling social services or something else, right? Somebody may have a mental health issue and maybe committing a crime. But is arrest the best situation for them, or is the best situation to call someone that can actually help them? So that's another example of where police discretion can come in handy. Okay, the police work environment lends itself to discretion. Um, Now, generally speaking, police work is low visibility. Now, this isn't the case as much anymore because everyone has phones, everyone has cameras. So a lot of what the police do now is very much in the public eye all the time. But traditionally speaking, police work was low visibility. Okay, so police would be dealing with someone other than the people standing around right there watching. Right, no one else kind of knew what was going on. So that was a situation where discretion could be used. Um, Officers work alone or in pairs. That also influences officer discretion. If an officer is alone, their ability to handle certain situations or handle them in a certain way varies, depending on whether they're by themselves, whether or not there's two of them, whether or not there's four of them. Okay, and this is especially applicable to conservation officers because conservation officers generally work alone. Also in police work, there's often no direct supervision. Rarely is an officer's supervisor right there with them telling them exactly what to do and how to do it. Okay, now there are hundreds of pages of policy, that police departments have trying to outline potential situations, but there's no way for an officer to remember all those pages, and often there's no supervisor there to tell them what to do. So they have to make the best call based on the information at hand, and that's where discretion comes into play. And then also most encounters occur with no other observers present. Okay, even in today's day and age, most police-citizen interactions do not happen with a crowd of people around. Most of them are one-on-one, where a police officer can decide individually how to handle a certain situation. And then finally, limited resources is another reason why police have to use discretion. There's only so many officers and only so much time per shift. So that means that officers have to prioritize what they do because they obviously can't handle every possible thing that they might come across on a particular shift. So they have to use their discretion to decide how they should be spending their time. All right, so then we have some factors that limit officer discretion and conservation officer discretion. Okay, there's legal factors such as Supreme and state court decisions. Okay, court decisions limit officer discretion because they outline what can and cannot be done. Okay, you have court decisions regarding evidence collection. You have court decisions such as Miranda, right? You have all these different court decisions that develop case law that make police officers behave in certain ways and make them do certain things. You also have state laws, right? State laws outline officers' jurisdiction. They outline officers' officer powers, right? All those things limit officer discretion. Then you have administrative factors. You have department policy. Okay, department policy may require officers to do certain things in certain situations. The policy may say, if this happens, then you do this. It limits the choices that officers have. If the policy says you have to do a certain thing in a certain situation, that's what the officer has to do. All right, supervision also limits officer discretion. Okay, supervisors provide guidance when to arrest. Supervisors review arrest reports. Right, supervisors tell the officers under their command what they should be doing, how they should be spending their time, what they need to be focusing on. And then you have organizational culture factors. Okay, we're talking about things like culture within the department, but also peer officer culture. What kind of culture is there in the department? Is it a culture where arrests are favored over warnings? Is it a culture where certain violations are always arrest situations? Is it a culture where certain violations are never arrest situations? Right? Those types of culture factors also limit officer discretion. Okay, so in addition to those, there's also situational factors, right, that influence discretionary decisions. So essentially what we're saying here is that officers are able to use their best judgment to make the best decision they can at the time. But there's all these other factors that influence that discretionary decision making, and oftentimes all these factors are coming into play all at the same time and interacting with each other while that officer is trying to make these decisions. So the situational factors, if you look at the Carter article, these are what's listed as legal and extra legal factors in that article. So things like seriousness of the crime. How serious the crime is impacts the type of discretion that officers will use. So, I mean, obviously, traditionally, felony is more likely to result in arrest than misdemeanor. Okay, and that's kind of traditionally what's happened. The felony misdemeanor scale has been used by officers to determine the seriousness of the crime. So, but when we're talking about conservation officers in particular, most of the violations encountered by conservation officers are misdemeanors. Okay, so they use a little bit of a different scale than what a traditional police officer would use. So, if we're talking about conservation officers, they've kind of created their own scale based on how serious violations are. Okay, they all might be misdemeanors, but some violations are considered to be more serious than others. So things like taking deer with the aid of an artificial light was ranked as one of the most serious. Shooting from a roadway, okay, taking fishing game during closed season or taking over limits, trespassing on someone else's property, violations include, for endangered species, commercialization of wildlife, where you're selling wildlife, trafficking wildlife, right? Those are also noted as very serious. But those types of endangered species and commercialization of wildlife violations, those don't occur very frequently, or officers don't encounter those very frequently. But violations like taking deer with the aid of an artificial light, shooting from a roadway, those are some of the more serious violations that conservation officers would come in contact with. All right, another situational factor is strength of the evidence. Okay, and this one obviously makes sense. The better evidence you have, the better case you have, the more likely an officer is to arrest or cite, right? So when you talk about conservation officers, many cases made by conservation officers are actually based on observation, right? Where the officer sees someone do something. So usually the amount and quality of evidence is very high. Other cases are made on more circumstantial evidence, citizen testimony, suspect confessions. Okay, so then at this point, quality and quantity of evidence definitely starts influencing whether or not a conservation officer issues a citation or not. Prior record of the suspect or prior contact with the conservation officer. The odds of a police officer or conservation officer knowing a suspect's history is actually pretty small. Even in rural communities where conservation officers oftentimes work, still the odds of knowing someone's history is still pretty small. But for conservation officers, the odds of this are actually a little bit better than your traditional police officers because you're talking about a smaller population of people. You're talking about people that hunt and fish, whereas a police officer would be dealing with an entire community. Conservation officers generally deal with more of a segment of the community. So they do have a better chance of knowing someone's history, but still the odds of knowing someone's history is pretty small. And this prior history can influence conservation officers' use of discretion. Those people that are known to be habitual violators are more likely to be ticketed. And then you have the use of discretion by judges and prosecutors that influences conservation officers' discretion. Okay, conservation officers have to consider their judge and prosecutor's preferences prior to writing summonses. So if the judge or prosecutor is not viewed as being very supportive of conservation violations, they may not write as many citations as those that have a judge that's viewed as more supportive. Okay, even if conservation officers have a supportive judge, they may still be cautious about the number of citations issued to any particular individual because they don't want to be viewed as being heavy-handed or just hanging a bunch of tickets on somebody. But as in regular law enforcement and regular criminal justice, in situations where there may be a plea bargain, the officer may still write more citations than they normally would in order to provide the prosecutor with charge that they can then dismiss in a plea bargain. When I was working, the judge told me, right when I first came to a county, I like it when you write these kind of tickets. I don't like it when you write these kind of tickets. Prosecutors told me the same thing. I really like it when you write these kinds of tickets for these violations. I don't really care for these. So I had to change or adapt what I did to what they wanted. Right? If I sent them a bunch of tickets for stuff that they didn't think was important, that would probably make me look pretty bad because they already told me what they wanted me to do. Okay, so the discretion of judges and prosecutors is important when you're talking about conservation officer discretion. The demeanor of the suspect also is a situational factor. Traditionally, police officers have been found to be more likely to arrest a suspect who's being viewed as disrespectful. Conservation officers are no exception to this. Conservation officers are probably more likely to cite or arrest a subject that's being disrespectful. But you also have to consider, and Klinger did a study on this, and he suggested that you have to look at the entirety of the circumstance rather than just simply the suspect's demeanor. So is it simply the suspect, being disrespectful, or is it the interaction between the officer and the suspect that leads to the disrespectful behavior? Right. So there is, some kind of gray area in here, but if you're just traditionally looking at it, demeanor of the suspect influences whether or not someone is cited or arrested. Suspect age has been a situational factor. Research really has been inconclusive, regarding a direct link by this. But conservation officers and regular police officers, they tend to be more lenient toward juvenile offenders. However, juvenile demeanors are taken into account here. Those with poor attitudes are more likely to be sanctioned, than a juvenile that has a positive attitude. And there's also some evidence that elderly violators were also treated less harshly, meaning more likely to get a warning instead of a citation. Suspect gender has been found to influence conservation officer discretion. Generally speaking, hunting and fishing is dominated by males. Now, that's not saying that women do not participate, but and that number is growing. But traditionally, more men have participated in hunting and fishing than women have. Women are less likely to be cited by conservation officers than are men. Now, this may be changing too as more women participate. But when you talk about women being less likely to be cited, the level of participation makes a difference. Right? Women who are actively participating are more likely to be cited. For example, if a situation I would run into fairly often, stopping a truck where they're spotlighting deer and they have a rifle in the truck, like they're wanting to go shoot a deer from the roadway. Oftentimes you had males, you had females, but a lot of times it was the males that were really involved in what was going on. The females were just kind of riding around with them while it was going on. Now, by statute, I was supposed to write everyone in the vehicle a ticket for that. But through using my discretion, I determined that the women were just more accompanying the men, just riding around having a good time. The men were the ones that are actually trying to shoot the deer. So I'd be more likely to just cite the men in that situation. However, if you have a situation where you have a woman driving the car to drop off a male to retrieve an illegally killed deer and then picks them up, she is then actively participating in the activity. So that would also influence officers' discretion. So overall, citations for women comprise a very small percentage of citations issued by conservation officers. We're talking about less than 10% of all citations are written to women. Suspect race, white people are more likely to receive a citation from a conservation officer. Hunting and fishing is traditionally dominated by white males. It doesn't mean that African Americans or Hispanics or other races or ethnicities do not participate in hunting and fishing. but it's been traditionally an activity that's dominated by white males, and over 90% of all citations issued by conservation officers are to whites. Suspect socioeconomic status. Little evidence exists that a suspect's social class influences officer arrest. Conservation officers more choose locations to patrol and observe rather than just people. So there's some thought that if the relationship that does exist is more a result of behavioral differences rather than officer discretion. And finally, the reason for violating. Some past evidence, and you always hear the story about if the offender's reason for taking game out of season was because they were needy, then it might influence the officer's decision to arrest. The Carter article, they did not find evidence of that, and most conservation officers viewed this as an artifact of the past. Right? There's so many social programs out there now. There's so much assistance that people can receive if they are in need. That the thought that someone has to poach to feed their family, that really is an artifact of the past. All right, there's also organizational factors. Okay, these are also known as administrative factors. Okay, policy has an impact on conservation officer discretion. Okay. So, for example, the federal funds are sometimes available for particular activities. So an example from the reading would be money available for boating enforcement resulted in an increase in boating citations. Okay, there was grant money available from the federal government for boating enforcement, and because of that money, there was an increase in boating citations. There's changes to laws accompanied by directives for leniency, at least for the first year. Hunting and fishing rules, boating laws, those things change fairly frequently. Conservation officers oftentimes will just issue verbal and written warnings the first year after a law is changed or enacted. Especially if that law has been on the books for a while and then was changed. And then other types of administrative activities, such as departments publishing the number of arrests made by each officer. That could turn into some kind of match 'em game, right? Where since they publish who has made however many arrests, other people try to match that, and it can lead to increases in citations. And then department culture, we already talked about this a little bit. So there are violations where they consider a citation should always be written. Then most officers would generally adhere to that kind of culture. And just like in policing, if a conservation officer violates the norms of the culture and either over-enforces or under-enforces particular violations, they may open themselves up to sanctions from other officers. And these are normally informal sanctions, but some kind of sanction from the other officers within their department. All right, so as you can see, there are lots of aspects to discretion. There's a lot of different situational factors, there's organizational factors, there's all these factors. So since we've established that discretion is important for an officer to be able to do their job, how do you control it? How do you keep it from being just the Wild West where people do whatever they want to do? Well, they use a system called administrative rulemaking. And administrative rulemaking provides direction for how officers handle particular incidents. Administrative rulemaking promotes consistency through departments. And because these rules are developed internally within the department, officers are more likely to respect them and comply to them because they were developed within the department. They're not coming from the outside in, they're developed within. They're oftentimes, those are called your standing operating procedures, right? The SOPs. So why you want to do all this? Well, the main reason to control discretion is to limit liability. Hey, if you don't have any policy, regarding officer behavior, that opens the department up to a lot of liability. Where if you have policy in place where officers have to do certain things, that really does limit the liability of that department. So you can make all these rules, but there are limits to it. One of the big limits is it's impossible to cover every situation that may occur um, by conservation officers or any police officer, right? There's no way to know exactly how everything is going to happen at all times, right? There's no way to write a rule for all those things. Okay, another limit is having policy, and having a lot of policy may encourage evasion or lying, right? If someone knows they broke a policy, they may lie about it. Um, if the rules are very complex, that creates uncertainty where people don't know what they're supposed to be doing. We know there's probably policy about it, but I don't know because it's complex. Um, and then the other limit is that when you have elaborate rules, officers may feel like administration is out to get them. Where if you have these, all the kinds of rules, large numbers of rules, it can make officers feel like the administration is really trying to get them. So it's important to have policy. It's important to have ways to, at least control officer discretion at least a little bit. But there is a healthy balance that needs to be maintained between organizations wanting to limit liability and allowing officers to be able to do their jobs. Okay, and with that, I'm going to quit for this week. Be sure you complete all the assignments for this week. And as always, if you have questions, please don't hesitate to ask them. I'll see you next week.